Hey everyone, Jim here, and in this video, I'm going to show you to get up and running with a virtual machine, which is often known as a VM. So virtual machines are used for a lot of different purposes. From the student or learner's perspective, these are really useful tools for experimenting with different operating systems, testing out unfamiliar software, and trying things out in a sandboxed or safe environment that is separate from your host or day-to-day use computer. From a business perspective, virtual machines are used all the time. Businesses traditionally would have servers in a data center, and each physical server had just one purpose. So you had a physical web server, a physical print server, a physical Active Directory domain controller server. And those servers took up a lot of space, a lot of physical real estate, and they weren't very efficient. So to help with manageability and scalability, companies move to virtual machines and use them all the time, using software just like we're going to be using here today. In order to be able to run a VM, you are going to have a nice enough computer. So ideally, you're going to want a modern device that has at least an Intel i5 or better CPU, at least 16 gigabytes or more of memory, and then a hard disk with at least 100 gigabytes free of disk space, ideally a solid state drive and not a mechanical spinning disk hard drive. That's ideally going to be what you're going to want to have. If you have a MacBook, it probably is not going to be a great fit. A couple years ago, Apple switched over their processing architectures from the more traditional Intel, also known as x86-based architecture, to ARM, which is what Apple Silicon is based on. And any virtual machines that you might find and download from vendors online on the internet, those are typically developed on Intel or AMD processors, and those are not compatible with the newer MacBook processors. So again, I would not recommend a Mac for virtual machines. And I have other videos, I'll link to one down below on my YouTube channel, kind of showcasing some of the issues with Apple Silicon and running VMs. So with that, assuming you have a nice modern computer that has the right amount of resources, the next thing you're going to need is some software. This is known as virtualization software or a hypervisor. This software is going to be installed on top of your host operating system, which is going to be your typical Windows or Linux desktop, whatever your daily driver, what you typically do your work with on your computer, that is your host system. And you're going to put another system on top of it, which is going to be your virtualization, your VM, right? That's going to sit on top of your host operating system. So you need software for that. My preferred software is VMware Workstation Pro. This, however, is a paid product. It costs a couple $100. So it is not cheap, but it is a really great piece of software that I use all the time for learning. I use it for learning networking technologies. I use it all the time for teaching and learning about cybersecurity, for testing out new software, for messing around with malware. It is a great piece of software and has a lot of bells and whistles and additional functionality that most other products don't have. So a couple $100. There is a free trial, which is what I'm going to install today on this system. I would recommend it. If you're looking for a free or cheap option, VMware also has VMware Player. This does not have as many features as Workstation Pro, so it's a little bit more cumbersome to use. So VMware Player is okay. There are some limitations. I believe the limitations are you can only run one virtual machine at a time. You can't take snapshots. You have less flexibility over the options you can configure. So it works okay, but it's not perfect. And there's also VirtualBox. This is another really good alternative. It has some additional features that VMware Player does not have, such as snapshots. But the interface is a little bit more buggy, I'll say, a little more cumbersome. And there are some features that, again, VMware Workstation Pro has that VirtualBox does not have. But again, it's still a great free alternative. And then we have Hyper-V. So Hyper-V is built into most modern Windows operating systems. You can turn it on and you can use it. That being said, Hyper-V is a little bit less common. Most people tend to stick with either VMware Workstation or VirtualBox. So for those reasons, I would typically recommend VMware Workstation Pro, and if you wanted the free option, Player or VirtualBox. Cool. So to download VMware Workstation, just Google around for it. You're going to come to the webpage for it, and you're going to scroll down, and you can download a trial. I already have that downloaded on my system. So I'm going to run through the installer. It's pretty straightforward. So click on the installer, say, yep, let's install the software. And essentially, you can install this with the default settings, and that'll be no problem. So wait for that to load. And we can click on Next. accept the terms, next. The default settings here are fine, next. And I'll leave the default settings as well here, next. And sure, create the default icons, next, and install. And there were some options that I did kind of skip over. So again, if there's anything you're unsure about, feel free to read up and do a little bit of your own research. You may decide like, hey, I want that enhanced keyboard driver, or hey, I don't want to be involved in the VMware customer improvement program. Do a little bit of research, select the options you're comfortable with, and continue on with the install. But the default options for most people are probably fine. So again, this will take roughly a minute or two. As this is going, let's talk about Linux and various distributions. So Linux is free open source software that is made available on the internet, and there's a lot of different versions of Linux. And those different versions are referred to typically as distributions or distros. They're made for like different purposes. One of the most common distributions of Linux is known as Ubuntu, and I already have that downloaded, but I'll show you where you can find Ubuntu on the internet. First, I'm just going to go ahead and click finish on this VMware install. So if you were to go to the Google and search for Ubuntu, you will come across the Ubuntu website, ubuntu.com, and you can download Ubuntu for the desktop environment or for a server. So we're going to say Ubuntu, so we can download now. We'll see if this is the desktop version. It is not. Download Ubuntu desktop. We're going to click on download now for the version 22042 LTS, and it'll download an ISO file. These ISO files are relatively large in size, so again, if you have a slower internet connection, this is going to take some time. This one in particular is like 4.5 gigabytes in size. I've already have it pre-downloaded. Otherwise, sit back, wait for this to download. This is going to be an ISO file, .iso. An ISO file is essentially a virtual DVD drive. So back before computers, or back when computers still had physical optical drives, typically your software would come on a CD or DVD. You would insert that into your computer and you install it. Most computers, as you know, don't have like CD or DVD slots on them anymore. So instead, you download this virtual format of that known as an ISO file. And that is going to be what you use to install your operating system. So once that is downloaded, you can open up VMware Workstation and you can create your first virtual machine. So again, you don't have to buy VMware Workstation Pro. You can run the trial, or you can try out VMware Player or VirtualBox or even Hyper-V. And you're going to be presented with a menu that looks like this. So I'm going to click on Create New Virtual Machine. You can also get to that same menu from File, and you can say New Virtual Machine. And there's a wizard that'll walk you through the most common steps. I'll say Typical. I will select that ISO file. And this may guide me through creating a user account automatically. I found that this doesn't always necessarily work, so I'll probably put in my information here, and then when I start this virtual machine for the first time, I may have to enter it again. That is okay. Let's try it out. Pay attention to the location here. I know some of you might be gamers where you have, a very large data drive that is slower and then a smaller but really fast partition for your operating system. If you don't want this large virtual machine to live on your main partition under C, users, your username, documents, virtual machines, you can change that. And again, virtual machines will take up anywhere from 5 to 50 gigabytes of space in volume. So make sure you have enough free disk space available on your computer. I'll leave mine in the default path. I also like to change my name. So I'm going to set this VM to be named Ubuntu-test. I'll leave the default disk size of 20 gigabytes left as default alone. Typically, you'll find Linux operating systems to consume less resources, both in terms of disk space and resources in use, so like processor cores and memory. I'll click Next. And I'm going to customize this. So how much resources should you allocate to your virtual machine? That's a great question, right? And it's not an easy answer. It's really going to depend. So generally speaking, Linux requires less resources than Windows. What that means is you can get away with configuring a Linux device to have just 4 gigabytes of RAM and just 1 or 2 CPU cores. Windows, that's going to be a very miserable experience. So the default recommendations for Linux are fine. But let's think about maybe potentially adjusting it. So first off, think about how much resources does your host computer have? If I look at my task manager in Windows, I'll see that this computer has 32 gigabytes of memory. So that's a decent amount. It shows right here. So I actually could bump this up. I'll bump this up to 8 gigabytes. Typically, you want to leave at least 8 gigabytes of memory free for your host operating system. Ideally, even more would be better than that. I try to keep 16 gigabytes for my host OS free. And if I'm on a lower end system and I don't have that much memory, then I'll set it to something like, 8 gigabytes, we'll say. So pay attention to how much resources you have and don't overcommit resources to your VM, because whatever you commit to your VM is going to be taken away from your host operating system. And if your host operating system runs out of memory or CPU cores or disk space, it's going to be a very slow, painful experience. Your VM is going to run very slow. So 8 gigabytes looks good. Same thing with CPU cores. Mine has 2 sockets, so 2 processors, each with 4 cores or 8 cores total. You want to make sure for processors you're not allocating more cores than are available on your host system. So again, I would leave at least 2 cores free for your host system and then allocate the remainder to your VM. So generally for Linux, 1 or 2 is fine. This is currently set to 2. I will leave it the default. Whether you go with 2 processors and 1 core or 1 processor and 2 cores, there are a lot of nuances with that. Just leave it the default for now. Just leave it at 2. You'll be fine. And the last thing I'll touch on for this menu is for the network adapter. By default, this is going to create its own subnetwork specifically for your virtual machines. And that's useful because later on in my class, you'll be setting up an Active Directory environment, and that's going to have a domain controller and a couple of different clients or hosts attached to it. So you're going to be running a couple of different virtual machines all at once, all attached to one private network, which is going to be convenient. Now, if you're going to be wanting to test things on your local area network, your LAN, so the network that your house or your business is connecting to your host computer with, you may want to choose this to bridged. So as a good example, an operating system I typically use is Kali Linux, and I might want to do some testing of the security of various things around my house. So in that case, I'll run Kali in a VM, I will set the network adapter to be bridged, and that way I can reach out of my virtual machine to test things around my home network. But for this use case, NAT is fine to leave as the default. So click Close, click Finish, and then I'm going to turn on my machine. It'll show up over here on the left. Looks like it automatically powered on. I'll click OK. And it's going to boot off of that ISO file to start the installation process. Now, at this point, your operating system may kind of automatically install itself based on those parameters you had put into the wizard, the username, the password, and your full name. Now, if it doesn't, that's okay. You can go through and manually walk through the installer. Not every operating system supports that wizard is what I'll refer to it as. So you might have to go through the more manual route, which is okay. Linux operating systems, if you have not used them before, they look very different than Windows. Oftentimes, there's different types of GUIs or graphical user interfaces. Those are known as desktop environments, and you can switch them. So it's not just one environment like you have with Windows. You can switch them out. And some of them don't have a GUI at all. It's just a CLI or command line interface. So you might only have access to a terminal or terminal emulator that you access the system through. Ubuntu, though, is known to have a lot of quality of life features built in, including that fun little jingle you may or may not have heard just play through my speakers. It's a very nice interface, and it's going to walk us through installing the software. So even though I put in my name, it's going to have us go through and do the install again manually, which is okay. So select your keyboard information. The default looks good to me. I'm using a regular US English keyboard. Normal installation is fine. Install updates as part of this installation. Go ahead and click continue. Next, it may ask me about my hard drive or maybe about time zone information. I don't know. We'll find out in a second. It's asking about hard drive information. So this looks really scary. Erase disk and install Ubuntu. But this is okay because we're doing this within a VM. It's within our own sandbox. So this is only going to erase our virtual hard drive, which is currently empty. So it is okay. We're going to say yes, erase. Yes, use just the default options and install now. Once you click continue, those changes are going to be committed. So at that point, there's no going back, but that's okay. Again, because we're doing this on a virtual machine. The time zone, select a location close to you. I'm over in like the Milwaukee, Waukesha area in Wisconsin, so I'm fairly close to Chicago, so that's fine. I'll leave that as the default. I'll put in my name once again. I like to name my computer the same name as the virtual machine, so I'll mirror the name as Ubuntu test. Username of Jim looks good, and I'll set a password. And now this install is going to start. So how long this process actually takes is going to depend on the speed of your host computer. If you have a fast, modern host computer with tons of memory, which you've allocated to your VM, with a nice hard disk that is hopefully a solid state hard disk that can run very quick, it's going to breeze through, maybe like 5 minutes or less. But if you have an older computer or one that has a mechanical spinning disk, it's going to take some time. I've seen this take anywhere to 1/2 hour to an hour from some very unfortunate slow students that had older equipment. So be patient, it'll take some time. Now, if you started your VM and you ran into an issue, an error message that said Intel VTX disabled or AMD disabled, that is not necessarily the end of the world. It may mean that you have an older computer that doesn't support virtualization, but more likely, if you think you have a pretty decent computer, it probably means that the option is turned off. So to turn on AMD-V or Intel VTX, the virtualization technologies for those processors, you have to go into your computer BIOS and turn that feature on. Now, I can't show you how to do that because every computer is different. The way you get into the BIOS is different, and where that option actually lives is going to be different. It's going to be specific to your computer vendor. So if you have a laptop that was built by Dell or HP, you can Google for like enable Intel VTX on my Dell Latitude 7400, or enable AMD-V on my HP yada 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 yada. And oftentimes you'll get step-by-step instructions telling you how to get into the BIOS, which is typically hitting a key on your keyboard multiple times when the system is starting, and then where to find that actual option. If you've built your own computer, typically you're going to want to Google for the manufacturer that made your motherboard. So in the case of my system down here running below, this is an MSI motherboard. So I would say, or Google how to enable AMD-V for an MSI, Unity, yada, 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 for that specific motherboard model, and there'll be instructions available online. How do I know that? Because when I built my computer, by default, that option was turned off. So I had to go and turn it on. So I turned it on, I made some notes about where that setting was in my BIOS for the next time I have to turn it back on, and I was good to go. So while this is installing, if you're just waiting on progress bars, one other thing you can try is downloading another operating system. So Ubuntu is a manual method that you get with an ISO file, which is probably the most common way to get a VM or virtual machine. That being said, your instructor, such as myself, or maybe online, you're going to find a vendor that gives you a pre-built VM. It's already configured, it's already been deployed, and they're essentially going to give you a copy of the virtual machine, not the installation media, but the virtual machine already set up and ready to go. And Kali from Kali Linux, that is like a really good example of one place I'll constantly download a pre-built VM. So let's talk about Kali Linux. So if you go to kali.org, you'll come to the Kali Linux website. Kali Linux is similar to Ubuntu. They're based on a very similar Linux distribution, and it includes a ton of hacker tools. So I teach cybersecurity full-time. That's kind of my main job, and I use Kali all of the time. So I'm constantly downloading Kali, setting up VMs for testing, deleting them, doing it again and again and again. And if you go to Kali's website, you can click on download, and Kali offers you a lot of different opportunities to download this operating system in different formats. The installer image is the ISO file, just like what we had just done with Ubuntu. It's the manual install method. It takes some time, so if you want to save a little bit of time, you may want to download a pre-built version of Kali under virtual machines. If I click on that, you'll see that Kali is available to download in a VMware format, a VirtualBox format, Hyper-V and QEMU. So different formats depending on what hypervisor or virtualization software you have installed. In my case, I have VMware installed, so when I come across these websites, I download the VMware version. So I will click on the down arrow next to VMware 64, and this will download a copy of Kali Linux for me automatically. This is going to come in a 7Z format. So this is going to be a tool that can extract that. It's going to be known as 7-zip. You can download that from 7zip.org. 7-zip, if you haven't used it before, it's really free, wonderful software that can unzip a lot of different things. Zip files, 7Z files, RAR files, MSI files, anything unzippable or extractable, 7-zip can do. So I've already downloaded the executable, and I'll run through the installer. I just have it on my desktop, and we'll install 7-zip. And it was that easy. So I have 7-zip on my system now. What else should we talk about? We're still waiting on Ubuntu. It looks like it's almost done though. I notice I have Activity Monitor up, or Task Manager, so I'll also show you this. You'll notice that my computer has 32 gigabytes of memory allocated, and it's currently using 11.6. So why is that? Well, it's because my virtual machine allocated 8 gigabytes, and my host computer is using like 3.5, right? So 3.5 plus 8 gets you to 11.5. So that's why to be mindful of how much memory you allocate to your virtual machine, because as soon as you power on your virtual machine, it's going to consume all of those resources. So my memory's been committed. I'll let this continue to install in the background. I'm not a huge fan of progress bars. And I already downloaded Kali, and I have the 7-zip file here on my desktop. Let's just go through a demo of extracting Kali Linux. You just right-click on it, and under 7-zip, you're going to say extract to the Kali folder. Now again, if you don't have 7-zip installed, you're not going to have this option available in Windows. So install 7-zip first, and then you can extract the Kali install. Once again, this process will take a time depending on the speed of your host computer. If you have a fast processor with a fast hard disk, this is going to go really quick, like a minute or so. If you have a really slow computer with a spinning disk, it'll be quick and no, it will not be quick. It'll be slow and painful. It may take 10 minutes to extract this file, unfortunately. And it is almost done. There we go. And if I double click in here, you'll notice this is much different than an ISO file. You see a bunch of VMware specific files in here. So essentially someone had gone through and manually set up Kali on their own VMware Workstation, and I took that file that was the virtual machine, that folder full of all those individual files, they zipped it up and uploaded it. So it's already ready to go. If you want to open up Kali Linux, again, because it's already pre-configured, we don't have to install it like what we're doing with Ubuntu. You can literally just go File, Open, find your extracted Kali directory, double click on it, and it's going to be added right here in your list. You can adjust your processor cores and the memory allocated. I'll leave it to the default, and you just turn it on, and you're good to go. No installation required, literally just download and open, and you have Kali Linux. And you're noticing now that I actually have two virtual machines running at the same time, both Ubuntu and Kali. You can have more than one running at a time, and it's a very common thing to do, especially if you're testing out various types of network situations, like you want to do some testing or running with Active Directory. Well, you need more than one VM. Or if you want to set up a LAMP stack where maybe your systems are separated, like a separate database server to Apache, you could do that using more than one virtual machine at a time. It did look like the Ubuntu installation finished, so we can go ahead and say restart now. And we've been working on Ubuntu now for like a half hour. And if I click on Kali, you'll notice that it's already actually done installing. It's just booting up now. So there's no installation required for the pre-packaged VMs. So they save you quite a bit of time. And again, I'm not a fan of waiting. So this is where if you're studying IT, I really think investing in a good, fast host computer is a good investment. Build that gaming computer, build that workstation, throw lots of memory in there. It's going to be a good investment. It's going to save you a lot of time. I'm doing this demo within an actual virtual machine, so you can run VMs within VMs. So this is running a little bit more slowly than I typically would like. That's okay. I just got to be patient. So there we go. I can click now on my name, type in my password, and I am in Ubuntu. So here is my Ubuntu operating system. I'm going to skip attaching any of my online accounts. So the default settings are fine. And then what I typically like to do, and this is one of the features that I believe is only available in like VMware Workstation or VirtualBox, is take a snapshot. So a snapshot allows you to roll back to a point in time. So if you install some software and then want to remove the software, you can take a snapshot before you do the installation and then revert to it later on. So I'm just going to do a snapshot of my base OS. So that way later on I can revert to it if I want to. And that's going to run in the background. Again, like everything else, it'll take some time, so you can pay attention to it running in the background. As snapshots are running, you can actually go and you can still use your operating system. So you can click around and do things. It'll just be a little bit more slow. So Ubuntu is up and running. Kali is up and running as well. I believe I mentioned that different Linux distributions will have different interfaces or different desktop environments. You'll see that Ubuntu looks very different than Kali Linux. So they're both Linux, and under the hood, they're both very similar, but the graphical interface, known as the GUI, the graphical user interface, is going to be different. So when you're done, you can either shut down your virtual machines or suspend them. So when you turn off a VM, those resources are going to be essentially immediately released. So if I have my memory tab up over here, you'll see that I have a decent amount of memory being consumed. If I were to shut down Ubuntu by right-clicking and saying power off, pretty immediately our memory is going to be released and you're going to see those resources return to Windows. So give it a second and you'll see it, yeah, boom, look at that. How much that dropped off. We're still using some resources that haven't turned off Kali Linux yet. So when you're done, you can turn these things off and your computer will essentially be back to normal. The hard disk space that is consumed by these VMs will remain though. Obviously things that are saved on your hard drive are going to be saved there 24/7, whether you're actively using them or not. But any of those dynamic resources like memory and CPU cycles will be returned once you turn off your system or turn off the VMs. So I'm going to wrap this video up for now. In the next video, I'll show you some like Linux essentials things, which I think are going to be really a lot of fun using this VM. So the goal for this lab is to install your virtualization software of choice. My recommendation is VMware Workstation Pro, and then get an Ubuntu virtual machine up and running. Get to the Ubuntu interface so you can start clicking around and doing some fun stuff within an Ubuntu VM. Do that, and then come back and we can continue on with our next fun video going through some Linux basics.